Joe Merritt woke at 5:40 every morning without an alarm. He had been doing it for so long that his body no longer required assistance. The habit had started years earlier, when Grace was still small enough to fall asleep in the back seat before they reached home from daycare. It stayed because life became easier when the day began before the world demanded anything from him. Coffee first. Always coffee first. Then Grace's oatmeal on low heat, vitamins arranged on the small saucer, and customers charged fortunes because someone skipped a 10-second inspection that would have revealed the truth immediately. That sentence had become more than advice. It had become a way of looking at the world. Joe closed the manual and placed it back in the toolbox. At 7:45, he loaded the delivery parts into his truck and started toward Commerce Drive. Across town, Sandra Cole stood inside her luxury service facility and tried not to think about how much money she had already spent. Always check the simple thing first. By the end of the presentation, nobody was looking at their phones anymore. Nobody was multitasking. The ballroom had become unusually quiet. Then a technician near the back stood up. "What's the most important diagnostic tool you own?" Joe looked at him, then smiled. "My eyes." Silence, then applause. Not loud applause, thoughtful applause. The kind people give when something obvious suddenly feels important again. After the session ended, dozens of technicians approached him. Some wanted to discuss repairs. Others wanted stories. A few simply wanted to shake his hand. One older instructor waited until the crowd thinned before speaking. "Henry Merritt was your father, wasn't he?" Joe looked surprised. "You knew him?" The instructor smiled. 30 years ago." Joe stared. The man laughed softly. "I was one of his apprentices." For a moment neither spoke. Then the instructor reached into his wallet and removed a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn from decades of use. Carefully, he unfolded it. A handwritten sentence appeared. "Always check the simple thing first." Joe felt something tighten in his chest. "You kept it?" The instructor nodded. "My entire career." Silence followed. Not awkward, important. Finally the instructor smiled. "Looks like it's still traveling." Joe looked across the convention center. Technicians discussing ideas. Instructors sharing notes. Young apprentices asking questions. Sandra speaking with managers. Grace writing furiously in her notebook. And for the first time, he understood what his father had really been building all those years. Not repair shops. Not mechanics. Not even expertise. A way of thinking. Something that could move from person to person long after he was gone. Later that evening, on the drive home, Grace finally showed Joe what she had been writing all day. He read the final entry twice. Grandpa thought he was teaching people to fix cars. He was actually teaching people how to think. The cars were just practice. Joe looked at the page for a long moment, then he smiled. "That's pretty good," Grace grinned. Research. Outside, the highway stretched toward home beneath the fading orange light of sunset, and somewhere, in garages and workshops across the country, a sentence written in pencil decades ago had just found hundreds of new places to live. 5 years later, very little about Merritt Repair looked different from the outside. The sign was still faded. The building still had 3 service bays. The coffee machine still sounded like it was negotiating with death every morning before producing anything drinkable. Customers still parked slightly too far left in Bay 2. Some habits, Joe had learned, were apparently permanent. Yet, despite appearances, everything had changed. Not because the shop became larger, it hadn't. Not because Joe became famous, he hadn't. And certainly not because he finally accepted one of the dozens of consulting offers that continued arriving every year. He hadn't done that either. The change lived somewhere less visible. In garages, workshops, training centers, community colleges, hundreds of technicians across the country now followed a simple practice that started in a 3-bay repair shop on Miller Road. Observe first, conclude second, verify before assuming. Check the simple thing first. The philosophy had spread quietly, which was exactly how Joe preferred it. On a cool autumn morning, Sandra Cole parked outside the garage and stepped out carrying a folder. Some traditions never disappeared. Joe was already there, drinking coffee and reviewing repair orders. Grace was not. That alone felt strange. Sandra noticed immediately. "Where is she?" Joe smiled. "College." Sandra laughed. "I keep forgetting." "I don't." Grace Merritt was 18 now. She studied engineering, maintained perfect grades, and still carried notebooks everywhere she went. The notebooks had multiplied over the years. Sandra suspected there were hundreds by now. Some habits, apparently, were hereditary. Joe accepted the folder and opened it. Inside sat the annual report for the apprenticeship network. He scanned the numbers, then stopped. 600? Sandra nodded. This year, Joe looked up. 600 apprentices? Across 43 partner shops. Silence followed. Joe stared at the report again. 600 young people. 600 future technicians. 600 careers. Beginning because a sentence written in pencil survived long enough to matter. Sandra watched him carefully. Not bad for a delivery driver. Joe laughed. Not bad. They spent the next hour reviewing program updates, success stories, employment placements, training outcomes, new partnerships, expansion plans. Every page represented people. The black Rolls-Royce Phantom sat under bright showroom lights. For 72 hours, it had displayed 47 simultaneous fault codes across nearly every major system in the vehicle: engine management, suspension, transmission, climate controls, safety systems, electronics. The car drove perfectly, yet every diagnostic system insisted catastrophe was occurring. Sandra had exhausted every available option. Her lead technician had failed, additional specialists had failed, which was exactly what Joe cared about most. Eventually, Sandra closed the folder. You know what the funny part is? Joe looked up. What? Sandra smiled. Most of them think this was your idea. Joe laughed immediately. It wasn't. I know. Sandra leaned back in her chair. It was Henry's. Silence settled softly across the office. Joe looked toward the old red toolbox sitting against the wall. The repair manual remained inside. The sentence remained inside. Some things deserved to stay exactly where they started. That afternoon, a group of apprentices visited the shop for a training workshop. Some came from nearby towns. Others drove several hours. They gathered around workbenches, toolboxes, and vehicles, while Joe moved between groups answering questions. One apprentice eventually asked the question he always asked, "What's the most important thing to learn?" Joe looked around the garage, then smiled. "Pay attention." The apprentice frowned. "That's it?" Joe nodded. "That's everything." The teenager looked disappointed. The other apprentices laughed because they recognized the expression. They had all worn it once, years earlier, before experience taught them that simple answers were often the deepest ones. As the workshop ended, another visitor arrived. Grace stepped through the service door carrying a backpack, 3 notebooks, and the unmistakable confidence of someone returning home. Joe smiled immediately. "You're early." Grace shrugged. "Professor canceled class." Sandra laughed. "So you came here?" Grace looked genuinely confused by the question. "Of course." Some things never changed. Later that evening, after everyone left, Grace sat at the same workbench she had occupied since childhood. The notebooks were larger now, the handwriting neater, the observations sharper, yet the habit remained identical. She opened one of the oldest notebooks and carefully turned the pages. Notes about science fairs, notes about apprentices, notes about fault codes, notes about conversations she once believed were ordinary. Now she understood they weren't. Joe watched from across the garage. "Research?" Grace smiled without looking up. "Research." A few minutes later, she closed the notebook and walked over carrying a single page. "I think I finally figured it out." Joe accepted the paper. "Figured what out?" Grace pointed toward the old toolbox. "Grandpa." Joe looked down at the page. Written in careful handwriting was a single paragraph. Henry Merritt thought he was teaching people how to repair machines. He was really teaching them how to think. Dad thought he was continuing Grandpa's lessons. He was really preserving a way of seeing the world. The apprentices think they're learning diagnostics. They're really learning how to pay attention. Joe read it twice. Then a third time. Finally he looked up. "That's pretty good." Grace smiled. "I know." Joe laughed. "You always say that. Because it's usually true." Outside, evening settled across Miller Road. Inside the garage, the last sunlight of the day touched the old red toolbox before slowly fading away. The shop remained small. The sign remained faded. The building remained ordinary. Yet somewhere beyond those walls, hundreds of people were solving problems differently because one mechanic had taken the time to teach another, and another, and another. Henry Merritt never became famous. Joe Merritt never became famous. That was fine. Fame had never been the goal. The goal was simpler than that. Notice what matters. Help the person in front of you. Pass on what you've learned, then trust someone else to do the same. The garage lights clicked off one by one. Joe locked the front door. Grace carried her notebooks toward the truck. Together they walked into the evening. Behind them remained a small repair shop. Ahead of them remained work, still worth doing. And somewhere, in another garage, another apprentice was probably hearing the same sentence for the very first time. Always check the simple thing first. The end. An elite diagnostic team from New York had failed. Even the manufacturer's senior technical staff had failed. 3 days, 500 specialists, $280,000, and still no answer. The manufacturer's team had delivered their final recommendation that morning. Transport the vehicle back to the factory, 4 to 6 weeks. Sandra stared at the glowing diagnostic screen filled with red fault codes and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: defeat. Then the side door opened. A delivery driver carrying a parts box stepped inside, looked at the screen for less than 5 seconds, and asked a question that nobody in the building expected to hear. "Has anyone checked the battery terminal?" The workshop fell silent. Nobody answered immediately. The workshop remained frozen in the strange silence that follows a question nobody expected. Sandra Cole stood beside the diagnostic station. Paul, her lead technician, stared at the delivery driver holding a cardboard box. 2 specialists from New York looked up from their laptops. The manufacturer's technical team exchanged brief glances. 47 fault codes glowed across 3 diagnostic screens. 72 hours of investigation filled the room. And somehow the first question from the man delivering replacement filters wasn't about software, electronics, control modules, or network architecture. It was about the battery terminal. Paul folded his arms. "The battery is fully charged." Joe nodded. "I didn't ask about the charge." Another silence. "I asked about the terminal." The specialists looked mildly irritated. Not because the question was offensive, because it felt too simple. The diagnostic profile in front of them represented one of the most complex electrical fault patterns any of them had seen. 47 simultaneous faults across 11 independent systems. That wasn't supposed to come from a loose connection. That wasn't supposed to come from something basic. That certainly wasn't supposed to come from a battery terminal. Paul glanced toward Sandra. Sandra looked at the screens. The screens looked exactly the same as they had looked all morning. 47 red warnings. 47 expensive mysteries. Joe set the delivery box beside the door. Then he started walking toward the Rolls-Royce. Sandra took a step forward. "I didn't say you could touch it." Joe stopped. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just waiting. 30 seconds, he said. Sandra stared at him. "What? Give me 30 seconds. If I'm wrong, I'll leave." The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogance. It sounded more like someone pointing out that rain was wet or gravity existed. A simple statement of fact. Paul looked at the car, then at the diagnostic screen, then at Sandra. Nobody had anything better. Sandra finally nodded once. 30 seconds. Joe continued walking. The specialists watched carefully. One expected him to connect diagnostic equipment. Another expected him to request fault histories. A third assumed he would at least ask for service records. Joe did none of those things. He opened the bonnet. Then he simply looked. 8 seconds. No tools. No computers. No diagnostic procedures. Just observation. Sandra found herself strangely irritated by how ordinary it looked. 3 days of technical investigation reduced to a man standing quietly in front of an engine bay. Then Joe reached forward and placed 2 fingers against the negative battery terminal. The connection moved. Not much. A fraction of a millimeter. Orange juice poured into the short glass she preferred. The preference had been declared when she was 6 years old, and defended ever since with the unwavering confidence of someone who had examined all available options and reached a final conclusion. At 6, 20, he knocked twice on her bedroom door. 7 seconds later it opened. Grace appeared wearing mismatched socks and carrying the notebook she had been filling for over a year, so small that nobody would have noticed it without touching it. Joe looked at the terminal for another second. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket. He removed a small adjustable wrench, old, scratched, the sort of tool most people forgot they owned until they needed it. 2 turns. That was all. 2 small turns on the retaining nut. Joe tested the connection again with his fingers. No movement. He closed the bonnet. Then he looked at Paul. Clear the codes and start it. Nobody moved immediately. The request sounded ridiculous. 47 fault codes, 3 days of investigation, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and now this delivery driver wanted them to erase everything because he tightened a nut. Sandra crossed her arms. That's it? Joe nodded. That's it. Paul looked uncertain. The manufacturer's lead technician looked openly skeptical. One of the New York specialists actually laughed under his breath. Joe didn't seem to notice. Orcare. Finally, Sandra made the decision. Do it. Paul sat behind the diagnostic computer. His fingers moved across the keyboard. Fault codes cleared. The screen reset. Silence settled over the workshop. Every eye focused on the display. Nothing happened. The system rebooted. Electronic modules initialized one by one. Data streams appeared. Sensors reported status. The diagnostic software completed its scan. 0 fault codes. Nobody spoke. Paul stared at the screen, then refreshed it. Still 0. He checked another menu. 0. Another system. 0. 47 warnings had vanished completely. Started, Sandra said quietly. Paul pressed the ignition button. The massive V12 came to life instantly. Smooth, silent, perfect. The dashboard remained clear. No warnings, no alerts, no faults, nothing. Just a perfectly functioning Rolls-Royce Phantom. For several seconds nobody moved. The engine idled quietly in the center of the bay, while every specialist in the room attempted to understand what had just happened. One technician checked the laptop. Another checked the dashboard. A third checked the communication network logs. The result never changed. The car was fixed, completely fixed, by a $12 wrench. Joe picked up the delivery box from beside the door. Where do you want these parts? The question sounded absurd in the silence. Sandra stared at him. 3 days. 500 specialists. $280,000. And the answer had been sitting beneath the bonnet, waiting for someone to check the simplest thing first. Joe walked toward the receiving desk with the same pace he had entered the building. No celebration, no satisfaction, no attempt to explain what had happened. The delivery paperwork still needed signatures. The parts still needed to be checked into inventory. As far as Joe was concerned, the work in front of him remained the work that needed doing. Behind him, however, the workshop had entered a completely different reality. Sandra Cole stood motionless beside the Rolls-Royce. The engine continued idling perfectly. The diagnostic screens remained clean. 47 fault codes had vanished as though they had never existed. Paul looked at the dashboard, then at the laptop, then back at the dashboard again. One of the New York specialists opened a second diagnostic application and ran an independent scan. The result was identical. No faults, no communication errors, no module conflicts, nothing. Just a perfectly healthy vehicle. Finally, Sandra broke the silence. Why did nobody check the terminal? The question wasn't angry. It was worse. It was honest. Paul took a slow breath. 19 years in diagnostics had taught him many things. Unfortunately, one of those things was recognizing when a simple answer exposed a complicated mistake. Because the fault profile didn't match a loose terminal. Sandra folded her arms. Explain. Paul nodded toward the diagnostic screen. 47 simultaneous faults across 11 systems usually indicate a network-level failure. Control modules, communication architecture, data corruption, something complex. Sandra looked at the Rolls-Royce. But it wasn't complex. Paul hesitated. No. One of the manufacturer specialists finally joined the conversation. The presentation was complex. Sandra looked at him. The specialist continued carefully. The symptoms looked exactly like a catastrophic multi-system failure. She had inherited her mother's eyes and her father's habit of paying attention to things other people ignored. The notebook contained observations, questions, and occasional sentences Joe said that she decided were important enough to preserve. She sat across from him and immediately opened it. "Deliveries today?" she asked. Joe nodded. "2 parts runs to the industrial district, and 1 to the fancy place on Commerce Drive." Grace looked up. "The one with the Rolls-Royce in the window?" That's what every diagnostic pattern suggested. Except it wasn't. No. Sandra stared at the screen. It was a loose nut. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. The reality sounded ridiculous, which somehow made it worse. 3 days of expert analysis, hundreds of thousands of dollars, international specialists, factory technicians, software reports, all defeated by 2 turns of a wrench. Meanwhile, Joe completed the delivery paperwork without any awareness that an entire room full of professionals was still trying to process what he had done. He was halfway through signing the final form when Sandra appeared beside the counter. "I need to ask you something." Joe looked up. "Okay." Sandra pointed toward the workshop. "When you walked in, why did you ask about the battery terminal?" Joe considered the question. Not because he didn't know the answer, because he was deciding how much explanation she actually wanted. 47 codes across multiple systems. Sandra nodded. "Yes. That means one of 2 things." She waited. Either multiple systems failed simultaneously, which is extremely rare, or one upstream problem is making healthy systems report bad information. Sandra listened carefully. Joe continued. "A battery connection is one of the most common upstream causes because it affects everything. You knew that from 5 seconds?" Joe shook his head. "No." Sandra frowned. "No. I suspected it. What's the difference?" Joe smiled slightly. "A suspicion is free. Proof takes 10 seconds. Sandra stared at him. The answer felt simple, irritatingly simple. "So you always check the simple possibility first?" Joe nodded. "Always." "Why?" That question produced a different expression. Not defensive, not proud, familiar, like someone remembering an old conversation. "My father taught me." Sandra folded her arms. "The battery terminal?" Joe shook his head. "The principle." She waited. Joe leaned lightly against the counter. "My father ran a repair shop for 40 years. He used to say the complex answer is usually hiding behind a simple problem nobody bothered to check." Sandra remained silent. Joe continued. "Most people see a complicated problem and immediately start looking for a complicated solution, because that's what makes sense. Sometimes." Joe nodded. "But not always." He glanced toward the workshop. "The more complicated a problem looks, the more important it is to verify the simple things first." Sandra thought about that. Then she thought about 3 days of diagnostics. The specialist teams, the reports, the manufacturer analysis, the recommendation to ship the car back to the factory. Then she thought about a loose battery terminal, and everyone missed it. Joe shrugged. "Everyone saw 47 fault codes. You saw them too." "Yes. Why weren't you distracted?" Joe smiled. "Because fault codes tell you where the symptoms are." Sandra narrowed her eyes. "Not the cause?" "Not always." For several seconds neither spoke. Then Sandra asked the question that had been forming since the moment the Rolls-Royce started successfully. "What exactly do you do?" Joe laughed softly. "Today? In general, I own a 3-bay repair shop on Miller Road." Sandra blinked. "That's it?" "Mostly." "Mostly?" "Deliveries help pay school fees." Sandra stared at him. The answer somehow made less sense than the repair itself. A man capable of solving a problem that defeated 500 specialists owned a small repair shop and delivered parts in his spare time. The math didn't feel correct. "You should be working somewhere else." Joe smiled. "I am working somewhere." Sandra almost laughed. Almost. Because she was beginning to suspect something important. Joe Merritt wasn't successful because he knew more than everyone else. He was successful because he remembered things everyone else had forgotten. And for the first time since the Rolls-Royce had broken down, Sandra felt genuinely curious about the man standing across from her. Sandra Cole had spent 12 years building a business around expertise. Certifications mattered. Specialized training mattered. Manufacturer relationships mattered. Those things created trust. They justified premium pricing. They separated serious professionals from people who merely claimed to know what they were doing. Yet, as she sat across from Joe Merritt in the small office beside the workshop, she found herself confronting an uncomfortable reality. "That's the one." She wrote something down. Joe watched her for a moment. "What was that?" Grace shrugged. "Just keeping track." Then she returned to eating oatmeal. A minute later, she asked another question. "Do they know you're coming?" Joe smiled. "They ordered parts. They know somebody's coming." Grace shook her head. "Not somebody. You." Joe laughed quietly. "No, not me specifically." She nodded and wrote something else in the notebook. 500 specialists had relied on expertise. Joe had relied on a sentence written in pencil. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Sandra poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of him. "Tell me about your father." Joe looked down at the cup for a moment. Then he smiled. "Henry Merritt." Sandra waited. "He ran a repair shop in Trenton for 40 years. Same kind of place as mine. 3 bays. Too many tools. Not enough parking." Sandra smiled faintly. "And he taught you all this?" Joe shook his head. "He taught me how to think. The repairs came after." That answer interested her more than she expected. "What's the difference?" Joe leaned back slightly. "Anybody can memorize procedures. Anybody can learn fault codes. Anybody can operate diagnostic software." He paused. "Thinking is harder." Sandra nodded slowly. Joe continued. "Most technicians get trained to solve problems. My father trained me to identify them first." "That's different." "Completely." Sandra looked unconvinced. Joe pointed toward the workshop. "Everyone saw 47 fault codes." "Yes. So everyone started solving a 47 fault code problem." Sandra understood immediately. "But there wasn't a 47 fault code problem." Joe nodded. "There was a loose terminal problem." Silence settled briefly between them. Sandra stared into her coffee. The distinction seemed obvious now, obvious enough to be embarrassing. "Your father figured that out?" Joe laughed. "My father figured out most things eventually. He sounds wise." Joe smiled. "He was stubborn." "Same thing?" "Sometimes." Sandra laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she'd had all week. The tension from 3 days of diagnostics finally seemed to be leaving her system. After a moment, she looked back at him. "The rule. The one about checking simple things first." Joe nodded. "Always check the simple thing first." "Did he actually live by that?" Joe smiled again. "Every day." Then he told her a story. When Joe was 14, a customer had brought in a pickup truck that wouldn't start. 3 mechanics had already examined it. One suggested replacing the starter, another blamed the ignition system, the third suspected wiring damage. Henry spent 6 seconds looking under the dashboard. Then he reached down and pulled a disconnected switch back into place. The truck started immediately. "What was wrong?" Sandra asked. "The owner's dog had kicked the fuel cutoff switch." Sandra stared, then laughed. "Seriously?" Joe nodded. "Seriously. And nobody checked?" "Nobody checked." Sandra shook her head, because they assumed the answer had to be complicated. "Exactly." She sat quietly for a moment. Then another thought occurred to her. "How often does that happen?" Joe smiled. "More often than people like admitting." Across the room, the workshop had returned to life. Technicians resumed work. The Rolls-Royce had already been moved from the diagnostic bay, yet the atmosphere remained slightly different. Every mechanic in the building had heard the story by now. Some seemed amused. Others seemed uncomfortable. Most looked thoughtful. Paul entered the office and stopped beside the doorway. "I owe you an apology." Joe looked surprised. "For what?" Paul folded his arms. "I dismissed you." Joe shrugged. "Understandable." "No." Paul shook his head. "Not really." The older technician looked genuinely frustrated with himself. "You asked the right question and I ignored it because I didn't like where it came from." Joe studied him for a moment. Then nodded. "That happens." "Still shouldn't." Joe smiled. "Probably not." Paul looked relieved. The conversation could have become awkward. Somehow Joe never allowed that to happen. Before leaving, Paul asked one final question. When did you know? Joe frowned. Know what? That it was the terminal. Joe smiled. I didn't. Paul looked confused. Joe continued. I knew it was worth checking. The answer followed Paul out into the workshop. Sandra watched him go. Then she looked back at Joe. That's what makes you different, isn't it? Joe raised an eyebrow. What is? You don't fall in love with your own theories. Joe laughed softly. Theories don't fix cars. Sandra leaned back in her chair. 3 days earlier, she would have paid almost anything for the answer to the Rolls-Royce problem. Now she had the answer, and somehow she found herself more interested in the man who found it than the problem itself. I think we need to talk about something bigger than fault codes, she said. Joe looked at her calmly. Okay. Sandra folded her hands on the desk. For the first time since they met, she wasn't looking at a delivery driver. She wasn't even looking at a mechanic. Joe had learned not to interrupt when Grace was collecting information. She always seemed to know why she was gathering it, even if nobody else did. At 7:30 he drove her to school. The morning traffic was light. Autumn sunlight filtered through the trees lining the residential streets. Grace spent most of the drive staring out the window. Then, without warning, she asked one of the questions she seemed to carry around for hours before releasing into the world. Dad? Yeah? She was looking at someone who possessed a way of thinking her entire organization desperately needed, and she had a feeling that the next conversation might change both of their futures. Sandra's proposal was direct because Sandra rarely saw value in circling around important decisions. She had built her company by identifying problems quickly and addressing them before they became expensive. The Rolls-Royce situation had revealed a problem she hadn't known existed. Not a technical problem, a thinking problem. Her specialists were excellent at solving complicated failures. What they lacked was someone capable of recognizing when the complicated failure wasn't actually complicated. Joe Merritt represented exactly that capability. I want you on retainer, she said. Joe blinked once. For what? Sandra slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. Not as an employee. Joe glanced down at the document. Good. Sandra smiled faintly. That was my assumption. Joe continued reading. The proposal was simple. When Sandra's team encountered a diagnostic issue that remained unresolved beyond a defined period, Joe would be brought in as an independent consultant. Fresh eyes. Different methodology. Someone whose first instinct wasn't to trust the computer more than the vehicle sitting in front of it. Joe finished reading and placed the paper back on the desk. Reasonable. Sandra looked mildly surprised. That's not a yes. Joe nodded. Because I have a condition. Now it was Sandra's turn to look curious. Tell me. Joe folded his hands. 2 apprentice positions every year. Silence settled briefly across the office. Sandra frowned. Apprentices? Young people. Joe nodded. From the neighborhood around my shop. Sandra looked confused. Of all the conditions she expected, that wasn't one of them. Why? Joe smiled slightly. Because my father was right. Sandra leaned back. About checking simple things first? About passing things on? She remained silent. Joe continued. My father trained apprentices for 40 years. Not because he needed help. Because he believed knowledge wasn't worth much if it stopped with him. Sandra listened carefully. And you want to do the same thing? Joe nodded. 2 positions every year. Real diagnostics. Real responsibility. Real training. Not observation? No. Joe shook his head. People don't learn by watching. They learn by doing. Sandra considered that. The request wasn't expensive. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't even particularly difficult. Yet somehow it revealed more about Joe than anything he'd said so far. Most people, when unexpectedly offered opportunity, asked for money. Better benefits, better contracts, better titles. Joe asked for apprentices. That's your condition? She asked. That's my condition. Sandra smiled. Done. Joe nodded once. No negotiation, no performance, just acceptance. The simplicity of it made her laugh. You really are different. Joe shrugged. My daughter says that too. A few minutes later they shook hands. The agreement was informal for now. Contracts could wait. Details could wait. What mattered was the understanding. Sandra had gained access to a way of thinking her organization desperately needed. Joe had gained an opportunity to teach. Both seemed satisfied with the arrangement. He picked up Grace from school at 3:15. The moment she climbed into the truck, she performed what Joe privately called the face inspection. 3 seconds of observation. No questions yet. Just assessment. Grace fastened her seatbelt. "Good day?" Joe nodded. "Good day. Fancy place?" "Very fancy." Grace smiled slightly. "Something happened." Joe laughed. "Something happened." She waited patiently. Grace had learned years earlier that rushing her father never changed the speed of the story. He told her everything on the drive home. The fault codes, the specialists, the manufacturer, the battery terminal, Sandra's proposal, the apprentices. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked out the window for nearly a minute. Then she asked, "Did you use Grandpa's rule?" Joe smiled. "Yes." "The simple thing first?" "The simple thing first." Grace nodded thoughtfully. Another minute passed. Then she asked, "Why didn't the specialists use it?" Joe considered the question. "Because they forgot where they started." Grace looked confused. "If you walked into a room and everyone was looking at the wrong thing, would you say something?" Joe glanced at her briefly. "Depends on the room." Grace considered that. What if it was important? Joe thought for a moment. Then yes. Even if they didn't want to hear it? Joe smiled. Especially then. Grace nodded as though a file somewhere inside her head had just been updated. She looked back out the window. Conversation complete. Joe continued. "When people spend years learning complicated things, sometimes they begin believing every important answer must also be complicated. But it wasn't. No. It was a loose nut." Joe laughed. "It was a loose nut." Grace stared out the window again. 3 traffic lights passed before she spoke. "Grandpa's rule is better." Joe shook his head. No. Grandpa's rule is the beginning." Grace frowned. "Of what?" "Everything else." That evening after dinner, Grace asked to see the toolbox. Joe led her into the garage and opened it. She immediately reached for the old repair manual. The same manual Henry Merritt had written in decades earlier. Carefully, she opened the cover. The pencil inscription remained exactly where it had always been. Always check the simple thing first. The complex answer is usually hiding behind a simple problem you didn't look at. Grace read the sentence twice. Then, a third time. Finally, she looked up. Grandpa wrote this so it wouldn't stop with him. Joe nodded slowly. "That's right." Grace looked down at the page again. "Then you used it today so it wouldn't stop with Grandpa." Joe smiled. "Also right." She closed the manual carefully and placed it back into the toolbox. Then she opened her notebook. For several seconds, she wrote without speaking. When she finished, she handed it to him. Joe read the entry. Grandpa wrote it down so it wouldn't stop with him. Dad used it so it wouldn't stop with Grandpa. Now 2 people every year will learn it so it won't stop with Dad. Some things are worth keeping going. Joe stared at the page for a moment, then at his daughter. "When did you get so wise?" Grace grinned. "I checked the simple thing first." Joe laughed. A real laugh. The kind that arrived when something was funny and true at exactly the same time. Outside, evening settled quietly over Miller Road. Inside the garage, a sentence written in pencil sometime during the 1980s had just found its way into another generation. And Joe suspected his father would have been very pleased with that. News of the Rolls-Royce repair traveled much farther than Sandra expected. Not because she advertised it. In fact, she specifically instructed her staff not to. The problem was that stories have a way of escaping when enough people witness something unusual. By the following week, technicians in 3 different cities were discussing a mysterious mechanic who solved a 72-hour diagnostic nightmare in less than 30 seconds. Most versions of the story were wildly inaccurate. Some claimed Joe used a custom diagnostic tool. Others insisted he possessed factory-level engineering credentials. One particularly creative version suggested he had designed part of the vehicle himself. Joe found all of them amusing, mostly because none of them involved a loose battery terminal. Meanwhile, life at Merritt Repair remained exactly the same. Oil changes still needed doing. Brake pads still wore out. Customers still forgot maintenance schedules. The shop didn't become busier overnight. It didn't become famous. and Joe preferred it that way. On Tuesday afternoon, a teenager named Ethan arrived for his first day as an apprentice. He was 17, nervous, and trying very hard not to look nervous. Ethan stepped into the garage carrying a notebook and wearing brand new work boots that hadn't yet accumulated a single scratch. "You, Joe?" he asked. Joe nodded. "You, Ethan?" Ethan nodded back. Both seemed satisfied with the exchange. Grace sat at a workbench in the corner finishing homework and observing the situation carefully. She always observed new people carefully. Joe handed Ethan a broom. The teenager looked confused. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Joe smiled. "Find out where the dirt is." Ethan blinked. "That's the lesson? That's the job." The teenager stared at the broom, then at the floor, then at Joe. Finally he started sweeping. Grace immediately wrote something in her notebook. Ethan noticed. "What are you writing?" Grace didn't look up. "Research." Ethan decided not to ask further questions. 3 hours later he understood why the broom mattered. Sweeping forced him to look at everything. Tools, parts, workstations, vehicle positions, customer habits. By the end of the afternoon he knew more about the garage than he would have learned from a formal tour. Joe finally approached him near closing time. Joe dropped her off at school and continued toward Merit Repair. The shop sat on Miller Road and looked exactly like the kind of place most successful business consultants would recommend modernizing. 3 bays, a faded sign, toolboxes older than some of the customers, shelves organized according to a system only Joe fully understood. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't fashionable, it wasn't trying to be either. What it was, however, was trusted. "What did you notice?" Ethan frowned. "Notice?" Joe nodded. While sweeping, the teenager thought for a moment. "You keep your most used tools closest to the lifts." "Good." Ethan continued. "Customers always park too far left in Bay 2. Joe smiled. "Also good." Ethan hesitated. And, you never walk anywhere twice, if once will do." Joe laughed. "Excellent." Grace looked up from her homework. "Grandpa used to say that." Joe nodded. "He did." Ethan looked confused. "Who's Grandpa?" Grace pointed toward the old red toolbox. "The reason you're here." Later that week, Sandra visited the shop for the first time. She arrived expecting something larger, not because Joe had claimed it was large, because people naturally assume expertise must exist inside impressive buildings. Instead, she found 3 repair bays, a small office, a coffee machine older than some employees, and a young apprentice sweeping the floor with extraordinary concentration. Ethan noticed the expensive car immediately. Grace noticed Sandra. Joe noticed neither because he was underneath a pickup truck replacing a worn steering component. Sandra stood beside the service desk for nearly a minute before Joe rolled out from beneath the vehicle. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Sandra replied. She looked around. "This is it?" Joe sat up. "This is it." Sandra smiled. "I expected something bigger." Joe glanced around the garage. "Why?" Sandra laughed softly. "Fair point." Ethan watched the conversation while pretending not to. Grace watched the conversation while making no effort whatsoever to hide it. Sandra noticed her first. "You must be Grace." Grace nodded. "You must be Sandra." Sandra smiled. "Your father talks about me?" Grace looked thoughtful. "Sometimes. Good things?" Grace considered that question carefully. "Mostly diagnostic things." Sandra laughed. Joe shook his head. "That's probably accurate." For the next hour, Sandra observed the garage. Not the equipment, not the facilities, the people. Customers arrived. Joe listened more than he spoke. He asked questions before suggesting answers. He inspected vehicles before discussing repairs. Every interaction followed the same pattern. Observe first, conclude second. At one point, Ethan approached carrying a damaged alternator. "I think this is the problem," he said. Joe looked at the component, then at Ethan. "Why?" The teenager explained his reasoning. Joe listened patiently. When Ethan finished, Joe nodded. "Reasonable theory." Ethan smiled. "Thanks." Joe pointed toward the vehicle. "Now prove it." Ethan's smile disappeared. Sandra noticed immediately. Joe wasn't teaching answers. He was teaching verification. The distinction mattered. Around lunchtime, Sandra and Joe sat outside near the service entrance drinking coffee. Ethan was checking voltages. Grace was drawing diagrams in her notebook. The afternoon sun warmed the pavement. For several minutes, neither adult spoke. Then Sandra finally broke the silence. "I understand now." Joe looked at her. "Understand what?" Sandra nodded toward Ethan. "The apprentices." Joe followed her gaze. The teenager was currently arguing with a multimeter. The multimeter appeared to be winning. Sandra smiled. "You aren't teaching repairs." Joe thought for a moment. "No, you're teaching people how to think." Joe looked toward the garage, then toward Grace, then back at Sandra. "That's the only thing worth passing on." Sandra sat quietly for several seconds, because deep down she knew he was right. Technology would change, vehicles would change, software would change, but the ability to observe carefully, question assumptions, and verify simple possibilities before chasing complicated explanations that would remain valuable forever. And somewhere inside the garage, a 17-year-old apprentice had just started learning exactly that. 3 months after Ethan arrived, the apprentice program was quietly becoming the most important thing Joe Merritt had ever built. Not because it generated money. It didn't. Not because it attracted attention. It rarely did. And certainly not because it made life easier. Teaching someone how to think properly often took far more effort than simply doing the work yourself. Yet every evening when Joe locked the garage doors, people brought broken cars there and got them back fixed. That simple transaction, repeated over years, had built a reputation stronger than advertising ever could. Joe unlocked the main bay and walked directly to the large red toolbox sitting near the back wall. Inside the top compartment rested an old repair manual from 1978. The cloth cover was worn. The corners were damaged. Several pages had been repaired with tape over the years. Joe opened the front cover. The same sentence greeted him. He found himself looking forward to the next morning in a way he hadn't experienced for years. Ethan wasn't the same teenager who had first walked into the shop, carrying spotless boots and nervous confidence. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. He asked better questions now, jumped to conclusions less often, paid attention longer. Most importantly, he had started noticing things. Joe considered that real progress. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Ethan stood beside a sedan with an intermittent starting problem. The customer insisted the battery was new. The starter had already been replaced by another repair shop. The ignition system checked out fine. Ethan spent 20 minutes examining diagrams and diagnostic data before finally walking over to Joe. "I think I found it." Joe looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding. "Okay." Ethan smiled. "Corroded ground strap." Joe nodded. "Maybe." Ethan frowned. "Maybe?" Joe wiped his hands on a shop towel. "Show me." 10 minutes later, they stood beside the vehicle. Ethan pointed confidently toward the corroded connection. "There." Joe crouched beside it. "Looks bad." "Exactly." Joe nodded again. "Now disconnect it." Ethan did. "Clean it." Ethan did that too. "Reconnect it." "Done." Joe stood. "Now start the car." Ethan turned the key. The engine failed to crank. Exactly the same symptom. The teenager stared, then stared harder, then looked at Joe. "I was wrong." Joe smiled. "Good." Ethan blinked. "Good? Very good." The teenager looked confused. Joe leaned against the workbench. "You know what's dangerous?" Ethan shook his head, being wrong and not realizing it. Silence followed. Then Ethan laughed. "That sounds like something your father used to say." Grace looked up immediately from her homework station. "Actually, Grandpa said being certain too early was expensive." Joe pointed toward her. "There you go." Ethan shook his head. "How do you remember all this stuff?" Grace looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because it's important." The conversation ended there, but later that afternoon Ethan discovered the real problem, a damaged relay hidden behind an access panel. The diagnosis took longer, the evidence was stronger, and the repair actually worked. Joe considered that a successful day. Across town, Sandra Cole was dealing with a different problem, not a vehicle, a company. Clark Automotive Solutions had expanded rapidly over the previous year. New locations, new employees, new responsibilities. Growth created opportunities. It also created inconsistency. Several branch managers had begun reporting the same concern. Technicians were becoming increasingly dependent on diagnostic software. Productivity remained high. Knowledge remained high. Yet troubleshooting quality was slowly declining. People trusted screens more than observations. Sandra immediately thought of Joe. The next afternoon she visited the garage again. Ethan was tracing a wiring diagram. Grace was reading a science magazine. Joe was adjusting wheel alignment settings. The scene looked exactly like it always did. Simple, organized, quietly productive. Sandra watched for several minutes before speaking. "I need help." Joe looked up. "With a car?" Sandra shook her head. "With technicians." That got his attention. An hour later they sat around a folding table near the back of the shop. Sandra explained the issue. Growing dependence on software, decreasing diagnostic intuition, technicians solving what computers suggested rather than understanding what vehicles were actually doing. When she finished, Joe nodded slowly. "Makes sense." Sandra folded her arms. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." "Why?" Joe pointed toward Ethan. "Tools change behavior." Ethan looked up nervously. "Am I being used as an example?" "Yes." "Okay." Joe smiled. Then he looked back at Sandra. "Every generation gets better tools. That's good. Usually." He nodded. "The problem is when people start believing the tool is doing the thinking." Sandra sat quietly. Because once again, the answer felt annoyingly simple. Joe continued. "Diagnostic software is useful, obviously. But software doesn't know the car." Sandra nodded slowly. "It only knows the data." "Exactly." Silence settled briefly. Then Grace closed her magazine. "It's like calculators." Everyone looked at her. Grace shrugged. "People still need math." Joe smiled. Sandra laughed. Ethan looked offended. "Why does she always have the best answer?" Grace looked pleased. "Research." Nobody asked further questions. 2 weeks later, Sandra invited Joe to speak at a regional training conference attended by more than 200 technicians. Joe immediately declined. Sandra expected that. A sentence written in pencil decades earlier by his father, Henry Merritt. "Always check the simple thing first. The complex answer is usually hiding behind a simple problem you didn't look at." Joe had read those words thousands of times. Henry Merritt had operated a repair shop for 40 years. Across 4 decades he had seen engines replaced unnecessarily, transmissions rebuilt for no reason. She asked again. Joe declined again. She asked a third time. Joe sighed. "Why me?" Sandra smiled. "Because they need to hear it." Joe looked unconvinced. "They have instructors. They have experts." Sandra nodded. "What they don't have is you." Eventually Joe agreed. Mostly because Grace told him he should. "Why?" he asked her later. Grace looked up from her notebook. "Because Grandpa would have done it." Joe considered that answer carefully. Then he nodded. Sometimes the simplest reason really was the right one. And for the second time in his life, a sentence from Henry Merritt was about to travel much farther than the small repair shop where it began. Joe Merritt regretted agreeing to the conference approximately 12 minutes after arriving. The event occupied an enormous convention center ballroom, filled with more than 200 technicians, instructors, service managers, and diagnostic specialists. Large projection screens displayed technical diagrams. Corporate sponsors lined the walls. People carried tablets, laptops, and enough certifications to wallpaper entire garages. Joe immediately wanted to leave. Sandra noticed. "Don't." Joe looked around the room. This was a mistake. Sandra laughed. "You haven't even spoken yet." "Exactly." Grace sat beside them in the front row, completely unconcerned. She was currently drawing something in her notebook. Joe pointed toward the crowd. "These people teach diagnostics for a living." Grace didn't look up. So they don't need me." Grace continued drawing. "That's not what Sandra thinks." Sandra smiled without saying a word. Joe sighed. Unfortunately, both of them seemed convinced he belonged there. An hour later, the keynote speaker finished discussing advanced vehicle communication systems. Another presenter reviewed artificial intelligence integration in diagnostic workflows. Then Sandra stepped onto the stage. After a brief introduction, she surprised the audience. Our next speaker doesn't work for a manufacturer. Several people looked up from their phones. He doesn't run a training organization. More attention shifted toward the stage. He doesn't publish technical papers. Now the room was listening. Sandra smiled. 3 months ago, he solved a problem that defeated 500 specialists and cost over $280,000 in diagnostic investigations. The audience immediately became interested. Joe closed his eyes briefly. Grace smiled. Sandra continued. Please welcome Joe Merritt. Polite applause filled the ballroom. Joe stood, walked to the stage, looked at 200 people, then wished the floor would open and swallow him. For several seconds he simply stood there. The audience waited. Sandra waited. Grace waited. Finally, Joe stepped toward the microphone. How many of you have ever spent hours chasing the wrong problem? Every hand in the room went up. Joe nodded. Good. A few people laughed. The tension eased slightly. Joe looked around the ballroom. Then we can skip introductions. More laughter. Now he had their attention. Joe walked toward the projection screen. A photograph of the Rolls-Royce appeared behind him. 47 fault codes. Multiple system failures. Red warnings everywhere. The audience immediately recognized the diagnostic nightmare. Joe pointed toward the image. What's wrong with it? Dozens of technicians immediately started analyzing. Communication network failures. Module synchronization issues. Voltage instability. Data corruption. Software conflicts. Joe listened patiently. 5 minutes passed. Then he nodded. All reasonable. He clicked the remote. The next image appeared. A battery terminal. Silence spread across the room. Then laughter. Then more laughter. Joe waited. That's the point. The room gradually quieted. Joe continued. The smartest people I know make the same mistake. Everyone listened carefully now. We see a complicated problem and assume the answer must also be complicated. He pointed toward the battery terminal. Sometimes it is. Then he pointed again. Sometimes it isn't. The audience remained silent. Not because they disagreed, because every technician in the room could remember at least one situation where a simple answer had hidden behind a complicated symptom. Joe spent the next 40 minutes telling stories. Not about technology, not about certifications, about observation, verification, assumptions. The danger of becoming too certain, too early. Every story led back to the same principle.